On a Wednesday morning in April of 2003, the John Deere dealership in Ida Grove, Iowa, closed its doors for the last time. There was no announcement in the county paper. There was no liquidation sale, no farewell signage in the window, no ceremony of any kind. Gary Fenwick, who had managed the service department for 19 years, showed up at 7 o'clock to find a padlock on the shop door and a laminated notice from the corporate restructuring office taped to the glass explaining that the location had been consolidated into the regional hub in Sioux City, 61 miles northwest. The notice included a phone number and a website. It did not include an apology. By 9 o'clock that morning, Gary was sitting in his truck in the parking lot because he didn't know where else to go. By noon, the 7 farmers from 4 different townships had called the dealership's main line and reached a recording. By the end of the week, the calls were going to Sioux City, where the hold times ran 40 minutes and the service scheduler was booking 6 weeks out for diagnostic appointments. In Ida County, in April, 6 weeks is not a wait time. It is a season. It is the difference between a crop going in and a crop not going in. Marcus Holta, who ran 1,200 acres of corn and beans in the northeast corner of the county, had a 9,600 combine that was throwing a transmission fault code he didn't recognize. He needed a diagnostic. He called Sioux City on a Thursday and was told they could see him in the 3rd week of May. He said the 3rd week of May would be after his planting window closed, or as the scheduler said she understood and that she was sorry and that she didn't have any earlier availability. He hung up and sat at his kitchen table for a while and then called the man everyone in the northeast part of the county called when they had a problem with equipment that didn't have a clean solution. He called Virgil Bauer. Let me tell you about Virgil Bauer because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his barn meant to every farmer in a 40-mile radius. Virgil was 64 years old in 2003 and had farmed the same 620 acres outside of Holstein since 1963, when he took over from his father, Otto, who had broken the ground himself in 1941. Otto Bauer had been a machinist before he was a farmer, trained in Stuttgart in the late 1920s before emigrating in 1933, and he had brought with him a relationship with machinery that was less about ownership and more about understanding. Otto believed you did not truly own a machine until you could take it apart and put it back together. He believed that a farmer who could not repair his own equipment was not a farmer but a tenant, dependent on someone else's knowledge and someone else's schedule. He had passed this belief to Virgil the way some fathers pass religion, not through instruction alone, but through years of working beside the boy in the shop, handing him tools before he asked for them, asking him questions about what he was seeing before telling him what it meant. Virgil had spent his entire adult life in that shop. The shop itself was a 4-bay steel building Virgil had erected in 1971 on the north side of the farmstead. And what it contained was not, strictly speaking, a parts inventory. It was something that had grown over 40 years the way certain things grow. Not through planning, but through accumulation and the specific intelligence of a man who hated throwing away something that still had use in it. Every piece of equipment that had broken down on the Bauer farm and been replaced rather than repaired had been pulled apart first and sorted. Every salvageable component had been labeled with a date and a machine designation and stored in the shelving system Virgil had built himself from angle iron and salvaged lumber along the east and west walls of the shop's secondary room, a space 22 feet deep and 14 feet wide that his wife, Dorothy, had called the museum since approximately 1984, and that Virgil had called the library for the same period of time, because he knew where everything was. He had cylinder heads for 3 generations of John Deere 4000 series engines. He had a complete hydraulic pump assembly for a 1967 IH8-06 still in its original paper wrapping. He had fuel injection components for a series of Oliver tractors that hadn't been manufactured in 30 years, organized in coffee cans labeled in his handwriting with a black Sharpie. He had transmission gears, PTO shafts, clutch plates, governor springs, water pump impellers, injection pump rebuild kits, head gaskets, bearing sets, and electrical components spanning a production range from 1955 to 1999. He had a wall of glass jars along the south window containing every size of metric and standard bolt and nut and washer and cotter pin he had ever removed from a piece of equipment and judged worth keeping, which was most of them. He had not set out to build a parts inventory. He had set out to understand machines and to waste nothing, and the inventory had been the natural result. The neighbors had been bringing him their equipment for 20 years before the dealership closed, not because he advertised, not because he charged less than the dealer, though he did, because he was good at it in a way that the dealer's rotating technician staff, trained on diagnostic software and replacement part methodology, was not. Virgil diagnosed by listening. He would stand next to a running engine for 2 minutes with his arms folded and his eyes closed, and then he would reach under the hood and press his palm against specific components in a specific sequence, and then he would name the problem. Arnie Schroeder, who ran 600 acres in the next township and had been bringing equipment to Virgil since 1988, said that watching Virgil work on an engine was like watching a doctor work on a patient, that there was a quality of attention there that made you feel the machine was being understood rather than simply fixed. Virgil charged for his time and for parts at cost. He did not charge for the knowledge because he did not think knowledge was something you ought to invoice people for. He thought it was something you passed around. When the dealership closed in April of 2003, Virgil did not say anything publicly about it. He did not write a letter to the paper. He did not post a sign on his property. What he did was answer the phone, which by the second week of May was ringing 6 and 8 times a day, and tell each caller to bring the machine in. Let me tell you about the summer of 2003 because it requires some accounting. Between the 1st of May and the end of August, Virgil Bauer diagnosed and repaired 47 pieces of equipment belonging to 23 different farming operations in a 4-county area. He fixed a fuel delivery problem on a 7700 combine that had stumped 2 technicians from Sioux City who had made the drive out in late June and spent 4 hours with their diagnostic laptop and gone home without a solution. He rebuilt the hydraulic steering on an IH1086 that Marcus Holt's neighbor had given up on and was planning to trade. He sourced a set of injection pump seals for a 1979 Oliver 1855 from a shelf in his secondary room that he had pulled off the farm's own Oliver in 1994 when he'd upgraded the engine, wrapped in a paper bag, and labeled in his handwriting, Oliver 1855 NJ pump seals, pulled 9/94 good condition. He found a crankshaft main bearing set for a neighbor's 1972 John Deere 402-0 and a coffee can he'd packed when the farm's own 402-0 had been retired in 1987. The bearing set was 16 years old on the shelf. It fit. The tractor ran. By September, the farmers in that part of the county had stopped thinking of the dealership closure as a crisis and started thinking of Virgil Bauer's barn as an institution. He did not think of it that way. He thought of it as what it had always been: his shop, his library, the place he went every morning at 6 and worked until Dorothy called him for lunch. The scale had changed. The nature of what he was doing had not. Let me tell you about the machine that most people in Ida County associated with Virgil Bauer, because it is the center of the story rather than its frame. In 1978, Virgil had purchased, at an auction in Sac County, a Minneapolis Moline G1 1000 Vista tractor, 1968 model year, in the specific shade of prairie gold that Minneapolis Moline used before the White Motor Corporation acquisition changed the paint code. He had bought it because the auction price was $210, because the engine was seized and the electrical system was completely non-functional, and because he had wanted a G1000 since he'd seen one demonstrate at the county fair in 1967 and understood what its torque curve meant for heavy drawbar work. He had spent 4 months in the winter of 1978 to 79 rebuilding it from the block up. He replaced the piston rings, reground the valves, rebuilt the carburetor, rewired the entire electrical system from the main panel forward using a factory wiring schematic he'd ordered from a parts house in Minneapolis, and fabricated 2 bracket mounts that the machine was missing using flat bar stock and a drill press. He had kept every single part he removed during the rebuild, including the seized pistons, in labeled boxes along the bottom shelf of the secondary room, because he believed that a part that had failed once could show you exactly what kind of failure to watch for next time. The G1000, once running, became the primary heavy drawbar machine on the Bauer farm. It pulled the chisel plow. It pulled the subsoiler. It did the work that required sustained, low-speed pulling force, the work that modern tractors with their higher operating speeds and power management electronics were not always ideally suited for. It ran every season from 1979 through 2023. Not without maintenance, not without occasional repairs, but continuously, reliably, and with the specific quality that Virgil associated with Minneapolis Moline's engineering philosophy, which was that their machines were designed to work at their rated load indefinitely rather than to produce impressive peak numbers that they couldn't sustain. He kept a maintenance log for the G1000 in a spiral-bound notebook in the shop. By 2023, the log ran to 4 notebooks. He had records of every oil change, every valve adjustment, every fuel filter, every set of points, every belt. He had records of what he had adjusted and why and what the adjustment had produced. He had notes in his handwriting about what the engine sounded like at different throttle positions and what changes in that sound had historically indicated. The notebooks were not formal documents. They were the written record of 44 years of paying attention. Let me tell you about August of 2021, because that is where the story arrives at its center. Dale Pruitt was 48 years old and ran 1,500 acres in Cherokee County, about 22 miles from the Bauer farm. Dale was a good farmer and a practical man who had built his operation carefully over 25 years, and he was not the kind of person who made careless decisions about equipment. In August of 2021, he had a John Deere 8R34. That was his primary tillage tractor, a machine that had cost him $312,000 18 months earlier and had a suite of computerized management systems that governed everything from the fuel injection timing to the load-sensing hydraulics to the transmission shift points. It was, by the specifications of its manufacturer, one of the most capable agricultural tractors available to production farmers in North America. It had been sitting in Dale's machine shed for 11 days with a fault code that nobody could clear. The fault originated in the tractor's integrated emissions control system, a component that governed the selective catalytic reduction of exhaust gases. Ron, the system, had thrown a code indicating a reagent dosing malfunction, locked the engine into a reduced power mode that capped it at 40% of rated horsepower, and declined to exit this mode regardless of what the dealer's technicians had done remotely through the machine's telematics system. The Sioux City dealership had sent a technician out twice. Both times, the technician had connected the diagnostic laptop, identified the fault as originating in the dosing injector assembly, and recommended replacement of the entire assembly at a cost of $6,400 plus labor. Both times, Dale had approved the repair. Both times, after the replacement, the system had thrown the same code within 20 hours of operation. Dale was in the middle of his fall tillage schedule, yet he had 1,700 acres to work and 40 days of suitable weather in a good year and a $300,000 tractor that was running at 40% and declining to be fixed. He drove to the Bauer farm on a Tuesday evening. He sat across from Virgil at the kitchen table while Dorothy made coffee, and he explained the situation. He said he knew Virgil didn't work on modern equipment. He said he knew the computerized systems were a different category from what Virgil dealt with. He said he was out of options and that the dealer's solution wasn't working and he needed someone to think about the problem differently. Virgil said, "What's the reagent?" Dale said DEF, diesel exhaust fluid. Virgil said, "Where's it coming from?" Dale said, "From the DEF tank, through the dosing injector, into the exhaust stream." Virgil said, "What's the temperature of the DEF when it enters the injector?" Dale said he didn't know. He said the dealer's technicians hadn't mentioned temperature. Virgil said, DEF freezes at 11 degrees Fahrenheit. It also degrades at sustained temperatures above 86 degrees Fahrenheit and produces a urea crystallization residue that will foul a dosing injector at concentrations well below what the system's sensors will flag as a contaminant issue. He said, "When you fill the DEF tank, where does the fluid come from?" Dale said he bought it in 5-gallon jugs from the co-op and stored them in his equipment shed. Virgil said, "What's the temperature in the equipment shed in July and August?" Dale did not answer immediately. He looked at the table and then at Virgil and then at the table again. Virgil said, "You've been running degraded fluid through a precision injector for a season and a half. The replacement assemblies are fouling for the same reason the original fouled." He said, "You need the system flushed, the injector cleaned, not replaced, cleaned, and your DEF sourced from climate-controlled storage." He said the repair itself was not complicated. The diagnosis was. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many thousands of dollars? How many weeks of lost tillage? How many hours on hold with a regional service center does it take before a man will sit across from a 64-year-old retired farmer and accept that the answer was about where he stored a 5-gallon jug of fluid? That is not a question about Dale Pruitt, who was a smart man and is not the subject of criticism here. There it is a question about what happens when the systems we build to maintain equipment become so complex that the people operating them stop being able to see the simple things underneath the complicated ones. Virgil drove to Dale's farm the next morning in his 2009 Silverado. He did not bring a diagnostic laptop. He brought a mechanic's stethoscope, a bore scope he'd bought from a tool supplier in 2014, a small container of diesel injector cleaning solution, and a copy of the emission system schematic he had downloaded and printed from an online service manual the previous evening. He spent 2 hours at the tractor. He ran the borescope through the injector assembly access port and confirmed the crystallization fouling visually. And he cleaned the injector in place using the cleaning solution and a sequence of purge cycles that he worked out from the schematic. He flushed the DEF tank and lines. He cleared the fault code using a procedure in the service manual that the dealer's technicians had apparently not attempted, which involved a specific sequence of system resets that had to be performed in order after the physical repair. The tractor exited reduced power mode. It ran at full rated horsepower. It stayed in that condition through the completion of Dale Pruitt's fall tillage schedule and through the following season, and has not, as of the writing of this account, returned a dosing fault code. Dale wrote Virgil a check for $300, which was what Virgil asked for. Dale later told his brother that the bill from the dealership for the 2 failed replacement assemblies had been just over $14,000. He said he did not know how to account for the difference between $14,000 and $300, except that one of those amounts paid for parts and one of them paid for understanding. Let me tell you about the winter of 2022, because it is where the story finds its full weight. Virgil Bauer had a small stroke in January of 2022 that affected his left side. He recovered most of his function over the following months, but his left hand was never quite what it had been, and Dorothy, who was 71 and had spent 40 years watching her husband work in that shop for 12 hours at a time, he has said that she thought perhaps it was time to think about what the shop was and what it was going to become. Virgil thought about it for several months. He thought about it the way he thought about mechanical problems, slowly and from multiple angles, without rushing toward a conclusion that might not hold. In September of 2022, he called his son, Carl, who was 43 and had worked alongside Virgil since he was 12 years old and had taken over the primary farming operation 8 years earlier. Carl had inherited his grandfather Otto's disposition toward machinery, as both Virgil and Otto had hoped he would. He had his father's patience and his grandfather's precision, and he had, in addition to these things, a facility with computerized diagnostic systems that Virgil had encouraged Carl to develop, because Virgil understood that the machinery of Carl's generation was going to require it. Virgil walked Carl through the secondary room for 3 hours. He explained every shelf. He explained the labeling system. He explained the cross-reference notebooks he had kept since 1977, in which he had recorded, for every part he stored, the make and model and serial number range of every machine the part was compatible with, cross-indexed with the year of manufacture, and the engineering revision that distinguished one generation of the component from another. He explained the logic by which certain parts that appeared identical were not interchangeable, and why he had marked those distinctions in red ink. He explained where he kept the documentation, the schematics, the service manuals, the specification sheets, the wiring diagrams, and how the filing system related to the parts inventory through a numbering sequence he had developed in 1983 and maintained consistently since. It took 3 hours because there was 40 years of intelligence in that room, and 40 years of intelligence cannot be transferred quickly. Carl listened the way Virgil had taught him to listen to a running engine, with his full attention without interrupting, noting what he didn't understand to ask about later. At the end of the 3 hours, Virgil sat down on a shop stool and said, "The parts are the easy part." He said, "What matters is knowing what something is before you know what it's called." He said, "When a man brings you a machine you've never seen, you look at it the way your grandfather taught me to look at things. You look at what it's trying to do. You look at what's preventing it from doing that. Everything else follows from those two things." Carl said, "I know, Dad." Virgil said, "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Let me tell you about what the barn has become, because a story is a present tense story as much as a past tense one. Carl Bauer runs the farm and the shop now. He has kept his father's inventory system intact and has extended it. He has added a digital index that runs parallel to Virgil's handwritten cross-reference notebooks, not as a replacement, but as a second access point, because Carl understands that there are people who will search a screen and people who will read a notebook, and both of them deserve to find what they're looking for. The secondary room has a new shelf unit along the north wall, where Carl has begun accumulating components from equipment in his own generation's production range. The early computerized systems, the first-generation telematics modules, the emissions components from machines built between 2000 and 2015 that are aging out of dealer support and becoming the kind of problem that the Ida Grove dealership closure produced in 2003, which is the problem of machinery that is too old to be a priority and too functional to be replaced. Marcus Holt's son, Tyler, brought a machine to Carl in the spring of 2023, a 2009 Deere 783-0 with a Phelan PTO clutch pack and a wiring harness issue in the cab, controls that had produced 2 months of intermittent fault codes and one very expensive misdiagnosis from a regional service center. Carl spent a day on it. He found the harness issue, a chafed section behind the right console panel where the harness passed over a bracket edge. By using a process of systematic elimination that Virgil had described to him in the secondary room during the 3-hour walkthrough, and that owed more to Virgil's notebooks than to the diagnostic software Carl also had available. Tyler watched him work the way Eli Drell had watched David Peck set chains, with the attention of a young man who understood that what he was seeing was not just a repair, but a method. He asked Carl afterward how he had known to look at the harness before looking at the controls module. Carl said because the module was new and the harness was old. He said, "You start with what's changed least and work toward what's changed most." He said, "That's how my father taught me, and that's how his father taught him, and it will work on every machine you'll ever own regardless of what year it was built." The G1000 is still in the Bauer machine shed. Carl runs it every fall for the subsoiling pass because it remains, in his assessment, the ideal machine for that specific application. Heavy drawbar work at low speed with sustained rated load output. It has been repaired over the decades with components from the secondary room, including the governor spring set Virgil replaced in 1991, the water pump impeller he replaced in 1998, and a set of front wheel bearing races Carl replaced in 2017 that he sourced from a box on the bottom shelf labeled MN-Moline G-1000 front hub bearing, pulled 1979 rebuild. New old stock, fits. The equipment dealers who sometimes come through and see the G1000 in the yard ask if it's for sale. The answer is no. The regional service managers who have heard about the Bauer shop and occasionally call to ask about sourcing specific vintage components are always told to call ahead and describe what they need. And Carl or Virgil, who at 84 still comes into the shop most mornings and sits on the stool and answers questions, will tell them whether it exists on the shelf and what the cross-reference number is. Raymond Bauer, Carl's son, who is 15 years old and has been in that shop since he was old enough to hand a wrench without dropping it, has been shown the cross-reference notebooks. He has been shown the labeling system. He has been shown how to look at a machine the way Otto Bauer learned to look in Stuttgart in the 1920s and taught to Virgil, and Virgil taught to Carl, and Carl is teaching to him, starting with what the machine is trying to do and what is preventing it, and letting everything else follow from there. The farmers in a 40-mile radius still call. The hold times are short. The scheduler is Virgil, most mornings, on a stool in the secondary room with a cup of coffee, surrounded by 45 years of labeled components and cross-referenced notebooks and the accumulated knowledge of 3 men who believed that understanding a machine was not a service you purchased, but a responsibility you inherited. The DEF storage in Dale Pruitt's equipment shed has been climate-controlled since the fall of 2021. No, he has not had an emissions fault code since. The Ida Grove dealership space is a farm insurance office now. The sign out front is different. The parking lot is the same. Some knowledge closes up and moves to Sioux City when the economics change, and some knowledge stays in a steel building outside of Holstein in coffee cans and spiral notebooks in the hands of a boy who is 15 years old and already knows how to read a wiring schematic by starting at the load and working back toward. That's what happens when a man sees treasure where everyone else sees